to make in this movement for racial justice. And second, there is so much that we can do right here and right now, yes, even during COVID, to create the world of justice that we all want to see. In our Yom Kippur liturgy, we atone for sins of commission and sins of omission. Sins of commission are things we actively did. We might not want to recall them. We might be embarrassed or ashamed of them, but we recognize that we did them and we want to make teshuvah. Sins of omission, on the other hand, are things we might not have actively done, but they're no less wrong. It could be what we know we should have done, but we didn't do, or not fixing something that we knew was broken. Friends, we are not bad people. Most of us have not actively oppressed others. Most of us have not actively contributed to racism. Nonetheless, our liturgy prompts us, invites us to atone communally in the first person plural. We say, Al chet shechatanu lefanecha. We take responsibility for our sins as well as those of our neighbors in our community. And in that vein, today we acknowledge our own passivity in the face of injustice. We've been blind to the inequities baked into our society. We've declined to acknowledge our participation in a system that favors us over others. We've insisted that our nation is about merit, when in truth, we know it's much more about birth. We have not done nearly enough to break down the barriers that exist in our community. We have espoused values with our lips, but we have been timid when it comes to living by them. We are not bad people, but we desperately want to be better people. And that's why we're here. That's what this day is about. Once Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Genesis says their eyes were opened and they realized. Yes, this year our eyes have been opened to things that we simply didn't want to see. We've realized that racism is not something that happens far away. We know it's lazy to shake our heads and lament, oh, that terrible thing that happened in Minneapolis or Louisville or Atlanta or Kenosha. That couldn't happen here, not in cultured, educated, sophisticated Westport or Weston. Well, friends, not only could it, it does. We've all heard stories of black neighbors stopped by the police for no reason. We've heard stories of students of color being targeted in our schools. These stories are true. And we've realized that some of our long-held beliefs that we thought were noble and good, are actually unhelpful. For example, many of us thought that being colorblind was the gold standard when it came to relating to others. But that paradigm turns out to actually be harmful because it homogenizes everyone. It doesn't account for a person's unique experience of the world. To apply this to ourselves, let's imagine someone claimed to be religion blind. He might say, I treat everybody the same. Trust me, I don't treat you any different because you're Jewish. Well, that's exactly it, I would respond. Judaism is an essential part of my identity. It has shaped my family, my background, my entire life. If you don't see me as a Jew, you don't see me as I am. I don't want special treatment, but I do want to be seen as me. We've also realized, friends, that dividing the world into two categories, racist and not racist, lets us off the hook. It lets us off the hook because as long as we're not one of those terrible people out there perpetuating damaging stereotypes or engaging in voter suppression, we think we're doing great. But now we know it's not enough. It's not enough to define ourselves simply as not one of those bad guys. We need to step into actions that undo racist systems and racist structures. And we need to do it on a regular basis. We've realized that we have benefited from a system that favors those with light skin. Most of us don't see our lives through this lens. We've just gone out and done our best to succeed in this world like anyone else would. But I have come to understand just how many unseen advantages I have enjoyed in my life. A family who built up wealth little by little over the course of generations. Parents who could buy a home in a top school district. I've enjoyed support and high expectations and the benefit of the doubt. In other words, I've been treated like I'm white. But this brings up an important question. Are Jews white? To be sure, we are generally perceived as that. And our light skin, as I said, has afforded us many privileges. But in reality, we can choose whether or not we want to be defined as Jewish. If I take off my kippah, and I guess this tallit and robe, I look like any other white guy. But in truth, we're not like everyone else. Our story and our identity are unique. We carry our own history of oppression, we know. And we face a newly strengthened anti-Semitism. We are not mainstream. We are not the majority. When I have to fill out a form that asks for racial or ethnic identity, I look desperately for an option other than white. And most often, I end up choosing other. Our otherness is precisely why we Jews have a unique perspective and contribution to bring to the racial justice conversation and movement beyond the color of our skin. For example, when the term white supremacy is brought into the racial justice conversation, as it often has in recent months, I feel the need to object. Why? Because there are white supremacists out there, and they're out to get me and you. I understand that I'm a part of a system of white privilege, but no one is allowed to lump us in with them. That I will not stand for. Friends, our most fervent commitment as Jews is to repair the world. So let's waste no time. First, let's acknowledge that it is simply lazy to think that the problem of racial justice will be solved somewhere else, in the South, in urban neighborhoods, or even in the voting booth. This is a problem that can only be solved everywhere, all at once. And we have to start here. There is plenty for us to do right in our community, right in our synagogue, and we can do much of it right now, even during COVID. So first, let's get our own house in order. There is bias within our own Jewish community, and we need to root it out immediately. For example, many of us grew up using certain unflattering Yiddish words to describe black people, or people who aren't Jewish, or others not like us. You know the words I mean. I don't want to mention them here on this bima. We know these words are demeaning and exclusionary, and we need to cut them out of our vocabulary immediately. More than that, we need to broaden our conception, friends, of what a Jewish person should look or sound like. Our Jewish community is growing in its diversity, and that's a wonderful thing. Experts estimate that 12 to 15% of Jews in America identify as Jews of color. We don't see that representation, that strength of representation just yet here in Connecticut, but our numbers are growing, make no mistake. Yet even those of us who were raised in a pluralistic mindset still somehow carry certain assumptions. I've heard parents doubt the Jewish identity of an Asian Hebrew school teacher. I've witnessed black visitors to our building treated as if they don't belong here. I've seen congregants with untraditional last names or darker skin colors have their Jewish identity questioned. We don't realize the damage that such statements can cause. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam, God simply spoke, and the entire world came to be. If language is powerful enough to create worlds, language is powerful enough to destroy worlds too. So let's commit right now, each one of us, to expanding our conception of what Jews look like, where we are from, and what our story is. Let's commit right now to ensuring that no one of any identity or background experiences bias or exclusion here in our Jewish home. Let's commit to ensuring that they are fully welcome and fully included here. And more than that, I want Temple Israel to be a place where we learn how to do and be better. Thus, we will be offering additional anti-racism trainings similar to the very popular one we offered over the summer. One for parents who are asking how we can help raise a generation of anti-racist children. Doesn't that sound wonderful? And one in partnership with other Connect congregations. And one for teachers in our schools. I hope you'll join us. The second action we can take, my friends, is to stand up for ourselves. With everything that's happened in 2020, it's all too easy to forget 2019's rash of anti-Semitic attacks on the streets of Brooklyn, in a kosher supermarket in New Jersey, and on a Hanukkah celebration in Rockland County. Let us categorically state that targeting Jews and Jewish institutions, attacking us for our identity, is not only anti-Semitic, it is racist. And let us also be crystal clear that targeting Jews for our love and support of the state of Israel is entirely wrong. Hillel asked rhetorically, Im ein ani li, mi li. If we do not stand up for ourselves, no one else will do it for us. With that in mind, I want to tell you the story of Norwalk firefighter Alex Horolick. One day in July, Horolick's lieutenant made offensive comments about dirty Jewish employees cleaning the bathroom. Horolick wrote to his supervisors, "When the lieutenant made this statement, he was looking directly at me, and he is well aware that I'm Jewish. It was a bizarre and awkward moment. The statement was made in a matter-of-fact tone and was not attempted to be comedic, teasing, or any other type of communication other than a bigoted, negative, judgment on Jewish people. I made it clear to the lieutenant that I was extremely unhappy with his comments and that I found them offensive. The commonality of using dirty Jew as an anti-Semitic insult and the historical context behind these words makes these statements even more appalling, and the maliciousness of these comments unquestionable. The other firefighters on shift with me that day who witnessed this told me that they were shocked and appalled by his comments and immediately found them to be offensive. Friends, we know it's hard to stand up for ourselves. It's hard because it usually involves calling someone else out. Firefighter Horolick's statement is all the more admirable because it involved calling out a superior. If he has the courage to stand up to anti-Semitism, then we do too. When we make anti-Semitism unacceptable, we make racism and all kinds of bias unacceptable too. And third, friends, we can take action right here in our beloved community. There's plenty for us to do, especially in a community as privileged and as largely white as ours. I am proud that so many of us have taken initial steps in recent months. For many, the first step was showing up to protests, and often bringing your kids along too. This was especially significant when the virus made being in groups uncomfortable. To those of you who attended protests over the summer, I'm proud of you. And now I'll ask you, what's next? Let me give you some options. We need to continue to diversify housing options in our towns. I know that there are a number of congregants who are already engaged in this effort. We need to join them. And we need to support Team Westport, our official town organization that is devoted to increasing diversity, and the RTM, which is taking steps to address health inequities exposed by the pandemic. We need to work with our police departments. I spent time this summer engaged with the police departments in both Weston and Westport. Our departments serve our communities very well, the vast majority of the time. And yet, both departments know that this is time for honest self-assessment. It's time to continue to improve the training and protocols that it applies, and to effectively address race and racism in policing. So too, friends, let's make sure our schools are communities of justice and equity. To all of you teens who are watching, this is up to you, not to administrators, not to teachers, not to parents. It's up to you. So, for example, I want to ask you to stop using the word gay to describe something you don't like. It's not okay. It's bias. We all know it. So let's just stop. And for all of us older folks, when someone says or does something that we know is wrong or offensive, we have to determine that we are no longer willing to look the other way, to avert our eyes, to excuse it, to let it slide by. We have to do this even among our own friends and family and colleagues. This is difficult, I know. But over the summer, I witnessed quite a number of white people, many Jewish, many not, participate for the very first time in group dialogues about race. These conversations were often uncomfortable, challenging, emotional. But you know what? At least those who participated were willing to step into the arena. They were courageous enough to become vulnerable and to try to learn how to do better. Friends, I am committed to keeping racial justice at the top of our agenda. I'm asking you to join me in stepping into anti-racist action on a regular basis. We entered these high holy days 10 days ago in the shadow of the loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I would add the shadow of the loss of civil rights leader Congressman John Lewis, too. These losses were particularly difficult because these two individuals were heroes. And God knows we need heroes in this world. Because heroes set an example for us to live up to. They set a standard for us to aspire to meet. But friends, the interesting thing to me about RBG and John Lewis is that they were simply human beings. They were not superheroes. They could not fly. They could not leap tall buildings in a single bound. Their powers were these: conviction, courage, determination. Those aren't superpowers. They are heroic qualities. And you know what? Each of us is in possession of those heroic qualities too. We need not be heroes. That is a lot to ask. We need only be tzaddikim, righteous people. We need only access the conviction, the courage, the determination that we have already within us. We need only live up to the standard we have already set for ourselves. Maimonides wrote, "Each and every person has merits and sins. A person whose merits exceed his sins is considered righteous. A person whose sins exceed his merits is deemed wicked." The same applies to an entire country. If the merits of all of its inhabitants outweigh its sins, the country is termed righteous. And if their sins are greater, it is termed wicked. And the same, he wrote, applies to the entire world. And Justice Ginsburg said in her 2004 address at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, "The demand for justice runs through the entirety of Jewish history and the entirety of Jewish tradition. I take pride in and draw strength from my heritage, as signs in my chambers attest. A large silver mezuzah on my doorpost, and on 3 walls in Hebrew letters, the command from Deuteronomy that Rabbi Moss quoted earlier this morning: Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue." Friends, we are not bad people, but we can be better people. We are not racists, but we can be anti-racists. We need not be heroes. Let us simply be tzaddikim, righteous human beings in a community and a nation in pursuit of tzedek, justice. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May it be so.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ari Ben Moshe, and I will be joining you this afternoon with our sermon discussion and Rabbi Friedman. For those of you who didn't get a chance to join us during Rosh Hashanah, we welcome you to please send us your thoughts and questions for the rabbi, and the email to do that is info@tiwestport.org. So if you can and you have some thoughts and questions, please send those in right now, and we will share them with the rabbi. Joining me today is a very good friend of mine, Eric Falkenstein, and for those of you who don't know Eric, he's a member of our synagogue, but also a Broadway producer, and if I would summarize his career work, I would say that he has a tremendous focus on civil justice and human rights. So I'd like to welcome Eric to our studio on the patio. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ari. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everybody yesterday.
Rabbi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ari and Eric. Thanks so much for helping facilitate this conversation with our congregation. Good Yontif to both of you. Gamar Chatima Tova. May you and your families be signed and sealed for life and blessing.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Just to start off, I think there was some audio difficulties in the beginning of your sermon for about the first 2 minutes. So just as an introduction to our discussion today, if maybe you could just highlight the first part, just give us a nice introduction, and then maybe that'll lead into our questions. Give you that opportunity.
Sure. Thank you. I started by saying that I noted on Rosh Hashanah that our world had slowed down quite a bit during COVID, and it gave us an opportunity to reflect on our lives, and more broadly, more communally, it offered us an opportunity to reflect on racial injustice and the history of our nation. I said I wasn't going to rehash the entire history of racial injustice. We're all, at this point, well versed in that, but that I wanted to focus on two things. One was our unique Jewish perspective and contribution to this dialogue and this movement for justice. And two, what we can specifically do now, yes, even during COVID, to help heal and repair the divisions in our society caused by racial injustice, and to create a society of justice that we all know that we all want to see.
Thank you for that. Just stemming from last week, there were some questions that came from our congregation that was more on topic with this week, so I want to maybe give that opportunity. One was from Deborah Rubel, and she, to refresh your memory, she said, you spoke about all of us experiencing loss. Mm-hmm. Another type of loss is the divisiveness we face in America today. Mm-hmm. How can we all help connect communities within a period of division and radical views?
To me, that's in the entirety of what I spoke about this morning. What's important to me, what I want to highlight, is that division isn't something that happens somewhere else. It isn't something that happens in the halls of Congress. It isn't something that happens between blue states and red states. We can heal division right here. If we think it's somewhere far away, that it's hard to do, we'll never do it. In fact, the Torah portion for Yom Kippur morning says the Torah is not somewhere far away in the heavens or across the seas that someone has to go and get it for you. It's right here. It's in your heart. It's close to you. You can do it. Perhaps I should have quoted that in the sermon too, but it gives me the chance to do it now.
Yeah.
So those of us, the worst sin we can commit, or the worst mistake we can make, or in the language of today, of Yom Kippur, the worst sin we can commit is thinking that this is someone else's problem, that someone else should step up and do it, and that we don't have anything to do or contribute to the problem here because we live in an educated, sophisticated, left-leaning community. I do believe that anyone in our congregation would welcome a black person, a person of any color or any background who moved in next to them or in their neighborhood or whatever. Anyone would welcome them. And that's a wonderful thing. We still have a great deal of work to do in our schools, in our police department, in our town, in our housing policies, in our synagogue, in our conception of who is a Jew, who belongs here and who doesn't, in our perception of who belongs in our community and who doesn't. We have a lot of work to do to repair that divide right here and right now.
And you talk about right here, right now, and in your sermon you were discussing, the bias that we have, how there's some Yiddish words that we were brought up learning and saying, admittedly myself. What are some of the things that, and just to take a step back, I think in your sermon also you mentioned about anti-racism training for adults and parents. What are things that I'm doing right now that I may not know I'm doing? And how do I change? How do I change this paradigm of thought that I've been raised as thinking is normal?
Right. So, first thing I want to say to you, Ari, and you, Eric, and to all of our congregants is, I know our congregation, and we are doing a lot of good things. Okay? That was really important. I want to continue to stress that. We are doing a lot of good things. We are also, on a day like today, thinking about what we can do better. So, as I mentioned, and as you just highlighted, there are certain words that we can strike from our vocabulary. Just in our lifetimes, there's plenty of words that we have struck from our vocabularies. We can do this. Those of us who were raised with a certain conception of who a Jew is, i.e. someone who looks like me, for example, someone who will break the fast with bagels and lox, as opposed to a Jew from Iran or from Morocco who might break the fast differently, or a Jew who identifies as black, Latino, Latina, etc., Asian, who might break the fast with entirely other foods. We can expand our conception of who is a Jew, who is part of our community, and that will therefore change how we relate to them and what expectations we bring. So first, I want this place, Temple Israel, these walls, to be a place of welcome and inclusion. I don't want anyone to feel excluded. In our communities as well, as I said, there's so many other institutions, our schools, our government, et cetera, we have to be willing to step in. And it's not just in our institutions, it's interpersonally too. I shared the story of the firefighter in Norwalk, Alex Horolick, because to me it's an inspiring story. Many of us are not part of institutions with such clear hierarchy as a fire department or a police department or the military. Here, in this case, firefighter Horolick had the courage and the conviction to very clearly call out a superior, when that superior used an anti-Semitic slur, an anti-Semitic stereotype. Too often, we shrink from that. And I know that not because I see all the things that go on, but because people tell me. People say, such and such happened to me, and I should have done this, or I wish I had said that. I want us to see, and so this is in two principles here. First, I want us to do that when people behave in ways that, or act in ways that are anti-Semitic, yes, that are targeted at us, but also we need to be able to step up and stand up for others. So if we are part of some group, or we overhear, or we see something that is racist, it is not enough to think, those bad people over there, at least I'm not one of them. We have to step into the space of righteousness. We have to step up as anti-racists and say, that's not okay, that's not acceptable. We have to be willing to put a little bit of our souls, a little bit of ourselves on the line for that.
And thank you all for sending in your emails. Again, it's tiwestport.org, and we welcome any thoughts that you have. Coming from Deb Goldenberg, she says, you mentioned that we are responsible for the sins of our neighbors. Can you elaborate on that? Does that mean We should participate in helping them make better choices and repairing the wounds of their sins.
To me, that's a great question, Deb, and to me that goes more toward the quote from Maimonides that I shared toward the end. Just as each of us has merits and faults, and we are, I believe, Maimonides believed, and I believe too, measured on the balance of our merits and faults, hopefully our merits being higher, so too our community is. So how do we add more merit to our community? There are proposals currently before the Planning and Zoning Commission, before the RTM, to increase diversity of housing options here in Westport. Weston has considered similar options. Other towns near us have considered similar options. Many times those options have been defeated. Are we going to sit at home and allow those options, those proposals to be defeated again? Or are we going to step up and enable our town just to increase the range of options for housing, which goes not only to race, but also age, diversity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. So it's not so much, I would say to Deb, it's not so much targeting any particular neighbor and telling him or her that they're doing wrong and re-educating them or something like that. It's about our town in general, or our society in general. How do we move our society bit by bit toward righteousness?
Our society nationally, as America, taking the focus on politics, Sabrina Glimsher asks, can you speak a bit about the effects of politics, local and national, and our need to engage in politics to fight against oppression and racist movements? And I would like to add your mention of the passing of Congressman John Lewis and how his fight for civil rights through our political system was different than what others might have done.
Yes, and and Eric, I'll invite you to also, this goes to your expertise and your professional passions as well. I can tell you all the things, I can say, we need to vote, which I'm sure we will, and Temple Israel we have a number of congregants involved in a Get Out the Vote effort. We sent out emails, and we'll continue to send out emails informing everyone of how they can vote safely and securely this November 3rd, or by absentee ballot leading up to then. I am less focused on this day, I'm less focused on the national conversation because, again, I think it lets us off the hook to a certain degree. It lets us say, oh, we have a representative and senators who are for all the right things. It lets us say, oh, it's so terrible that we lost Justice Ginsburg and now the Supreme Court's going to go in a very different direction. What can I do? And yes, I know we'll vote, but beyond that, it's sort of we sort of feel like, well, what can we do? There's a lot we can do. I know there are congregants, for example, who are involved in Get Out the Vote efforts, not in Connecticut, in states that will have more of a tipping power in the election, in the Electoral College. I really think that Westport can become, I don't want to put this off on other places. As I said, it's easy for us to say, Minneapolis should do that or Atlanta should do that. I want us to focus on getting our own house in order. I want us to focus on Westport becoming the community that we know that we want it to be. I'll pause there, and maybe Eric has more thoughts to add there.
Well, I just I think some of us spend a lot of time in our minds on certain decades or periods of our own lives or even in history. And one that I'm always living in some ways is the civil rights movement of the late 50s and the 60s. And so what comes to mind is, and John Lewis heard Dr. King preaching, luckily for all of us, or he doesn't know that he ever would have been drawn into the same set of circumstances. An extraordinary person. He he was selfless to an extraordinary degree. I mean, just always looking out for other people, and seemingly, that I could ever personally witness or witness through history, worrying about himself. But what he and Dr. King, and actually, although I didn't study in the same depth, or haven't studied in the same depth, Mandela and Gandhi, and I think young Malala, I mean, what all these people have said in some ways, and Dr. King extremely explicitly, is that the root of, or much of the root of racism is in a lack of understanding, a lack of connection, a lack of ability to get some sense for your neighbor of, in this case, most likely different colored skin or background. And there's a great quote that I'm not going to try to get exact, because it's simple, and yet it's also so profound. Dr. King, during the bus boycott in the 50s, young man, he was still in his 20s and not his late 20s yet, he basically said to the white community, look, you don't like us because you fear us because you don't know us, and you don't know us because there's no opportunity to get to know us. Definitely not a direct quote, but very close. And what he was saying is that we all, as human beings, are striving for the same things. And when we get to educate each other, it changes the nature of the dynamic between people. And that's why when we have a neighbor of a different background, all we have to do is get to know them, and unless they are something that I think afflicts the world too in a different way that has nothing to do with race, people can be individually rude. That has nothing to do with it. That's different. But in general, when it comes to race and background, it's about that education, or the education element of getting to know someone. And one other just sort of a quick thing is that there are great organizations. One I wish I had done more with already, one like Seeds of Hope. I've gotten stories, it wasn't part of it, but of stories of kids like Israelis and Palestinians coming, I think, to Maine and sort of integrating as a summer camp. And they come back as best of friends. It didn't matter to them, just like I think it doesn't matter to young people who haven't been taught otherwise.
Sure.
It makes a huge difference to get to know your
So I love that answer, and it presents two challenges for us. Okay, one is we've chosen to live in a largely white community, and yes, we can talk about making this a community for, you know, that folks of various backgrounds will want to live in, and that's important. But how do we get out of the bubble? For our own sakes, and more importantly, for the sake of our children. How do we get out of the bubble so they'll interact with people who are truly different from us? That's a challenge.
Sure.
I don't know if it's answerable, but I'll just set that out. And then to go to politics, which is Deb's question, I think. How many of us regularly interact with people with whom we politically disagree? And interact in a real give and take and listening of ideas, not just, oh, well, we disagree, so I can't talk about this. A lot of the breakdown in getting to know you has been an unwillingness to even converse, right? We've gone from in not a very long time, gone from a world in which Justice Ginsburg was confirmed with 96 votes in the Senate to a world in which no one nominated by either party could be confirmed with any votes from the other party, I don't think. We've come a long way, and it presents, I have questions, right? I pose those questions. I don't have that great answers to them.
Well, it seems we could spend a lot of time on this one topic. But to get some other thoughts out, Lawrence Latkin asks, how do we handle anti-Semitism in the progressive movement, sometimes manifested in desecration of synagogues? If we have an affinity for the progressive ideal of prioritizing anti-racist ideals, how can we join when we are polarizing ourselves as Zionists or as money-grubbing Jews?
Yeah, okay, so this is a very sophisticated question. No surprise coming from Lawrence.
Yeah.
It's important for us to recognize, and this is not something that not a lot of people are aware of, that anti-Semitism is a huge problem both on the far right Those are those white supremacists that I was talking about, people who are out to often physically do us harm as Jews, and also on the far left. On the far left, it comes more often in the form of an insistence on certain ideological, I'll call it purity. For example, I'll just give you one example that I received from a friend and congregant. Cornell University, activist groups at Cornell University recently presented the provost and other university leaders with all sorts of demands for racial justice, and at the bottom was a demand to not have anything to do with the military occupation of Palestine. What I have said often, and I'll say it again, I'll say it publicly many times, is I think it's super important for us to say the words Black Lives Matter and to mention the names of those who've been killed in racial violence. I think many of the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement are very important. But it is very problematic to align ourselves with the organization Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter has taken an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel stance, a very strong anti-Zionist, anti-Israel stance. And many of the times when we get into supporting justice, we have to be very careful that justice doesn't mean anti-Israel. Because all too often on the left, it does, it can and it does. And all too often on the left, what I'm hearing is that those who love and support Israel, from our students to our adults, are shut down and are not allowed to share their pride in, their support for the state of Israel. And obviously that's extremely problematic.
So, as a follow-up, Michael Hollander says, we as Jews need to stand up against anti-Semitic people. Do you believe that racism is anti-Semitism?
I would reverse it, I would say.
I would reverse it as well.
I would say
that
that at this point I believe that anti-Semitism is racism. Okay? Why?
Do you, as a follow-up, do you believe that being Jewish is a race?
Oh. So let's first say that race is a construct. Mm-hmm. Okay? There's no objective thing such as race, right? I would say separately that Judaism is, I guess Judaism is also a construct if we're going to get philosophical about it, but there is such an objective thing as Judaism. We get to define it for ourselves, okay? So is Judaism a race? I am uncomfortable defining Judaism in those terms. We are certainly an ethnicity. We are certainly a tribe. We are certainly a cultural group. We are certainly a religious group. We exist in and between and covering all of those. But here's why it's difficult for me to define Judaism as a race. Surely one can be born as a Jew. I was. One can also choose to become Jewish. And those who choose to become Jewish are treated no different from anyone who was born Jewish. In fact, to treat that person differently is totally not allowed in rabbinic tradition, in Jewish tradition. So we're a family, a tribe, a religion, an ethnicity, all of the above. But race, I have trouble defining us as race. I think it's very problematic to define us as a race. And on top of all of that, I'm also disturbed to define us as a race because that's what Hitler did.
David Levy and Bob Brody mentioned that in general, defining Jewishness as a race has been problematic. This is especially important because the equation of Zionism equals racism is one that was finally expunged from modern life. So he'd like you to expand on that topic.
Yes. So to me, this goes to the how we American Jews have, and I'll say it in a very general sense, viewed Israel through the generations. For a generation older than me, let's just say, was raised with Israel as like the plucky little refuge of Holocaust survivors and Jewish refugees constantly fighting against these massive Arab armies who wanted to invade and destroy it. And that's a certain view of Israel. In my generation, Israel was a strong and proud fact on the ground, secure, militarily mighty, and always trying to figure out how to get along with the people who live next door to it and for whom it claims certain responsibility, i.e. the Palestinians. So I always see Israel, I think probably my overriding image or narrative of Israel is how does Israel learn to live in peace and security with its neighbors? But there's a third generation, a generation younger than me, that has, very sadly, and this is very difficult for me to understand myself, come to see Israel as the white colonialist oppressor of darker-skinned peoples, i.e. the Palestinians. And that's how you get to the Zionism equals racism equation, which I will say is completely false and itself, I think, racist. So we have a challenge in the Jewish community, which is that we all need to be able to talk about Israel productively, meaningfully, when we span these three different generations that have, as I said, in very general terms, very different and distinct conceptions of what the state of Israel is and should be. Fortunately, I'm proud that here at Temple Israel, we've always been able to talk about Israel with pride and with joy, and also with the pain of understanding that Israel is not yet what we wish it would be. Mm-hmm. But the Zionism equals racism is exactly what's fueling that left-wing anti-Semitism, is exactly what is very problematic in our Jewish world today.
Zoe wonders if you believe those surveys that you check off should include Jewish as one of the options.
Yeah, you know, that's such a great question. I always wonder the same thing. Because if we include, the question is whether it's race or ethnicity. If it's race, which could be problematic, we could say like, no, none of these surveys should include race at all, but I'll just take it from a Jewish perspective. I just told you that I don't think Judaism is a race. So what am I supposed to check? I don't want to check white. I'm not black, I'm not Hispanic, I'm not Asian. I guess the only option for me to check is other. But if we go to ethnicity, then I believe we have to open the box far, far, far wider than the 5 or 6 or 7 choices that we're normally given, right? Because ethnicity could be not just, ethnicity within any particular group, there could be all sorts of different ethnicities. Would we, for example, among Jews, would we have to define Ashkenazic Jewish, Sephardic Jewish? Because one could argue that those are two very different ethnicities. So we need like 100 or 200 options, which is maybe what we should advocate for, I don't know, or the elimination of those options completely. But it's a great question.
Julie Sharp, just to touch on Justice Ginsburg. How do we take pride in Justice Ginsburg's viewing herself as a Jewish justice and not view ourselves as bigoted by expressing concerns about a potential justice whose view of the law is informed by her Catholicism?
Exactly. As a Jew, I don't have a problem with, or I should say as a rabbi, I don't have a problem with a justice whose point of view is informed by their religious beliefs. We've had 8 Jews on the Supreme Court. Until recently, the Supreme Court was made up exclusively of Jews and Catholics. There were 3 Jews and 6 Catholics on the Supreme Court until very recently. Did that leave out Protestants, Muslims, Hindus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it's possible to have a justice who is not influenced in some way by views beyond the law. For those of us who are religious, we could call them religious views. For other people, they might be all sorts of other, views influenced by ethnicity, by race, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's possible for us, or I don't think it's fair for us to say that a justice shouldn't have some religious views, be informed by religious views. I would hope, though, that if we saw a justice, Jewish or otherwise, who we thought was overly informed by their religious views, that would concern us and that we might speak up, and that we would do it equally for someone who's Jewish or someone who's Catholic or any other religion. I'm reminded that when JFK ran for president in 1960, there was a fear among some Americans that he would be controlled by the Pope. Fortunately, we're well beyond that. We no longer have those thoughts, those concerns. Even Jews are able to run for high office without concern that we have, dual loyalties. And so I would hope the same would be the case for Supreme Court justices.
Times of COVID, we've been saying have brought about change or has given us an opportunity to reflect on what's happening in our world. There have been protests in groups, in large groups. Peggy Budd asks that protesting during non-COVID times is one thing, but celebrating or encouraging people to protest in groups during this time of COVID, I believe it's wrong, and some can't. Please clarify how you can encourage people to do this. And I'd like to just add for the group, what things have we seen change now in times of COVID, and how is this discussion of racism and the need for equality, how has that changed now just in our everyday experiences?
Sure. Yeah, so I want to be clear to Peggy and to everybody else that I didn't think, or I didn't seem, I hope I didn't encourage people to go out and do something that was dangerous. I myself, I recognize that protests can be a great way to get out our frustration and anger, but I myself am a proponent of all sorts of other methods of applying our power and our influence, many of which don't require us even to leave the home at all, especially these days, right? So it's become much more possible for us to participate, for example, in town meetings and school board meetings, to talk with the leadership of the police departments, et cetera, all using phone and Zoom, without even leaving our homes. So to me, that presents an opportunity now. In terms of actually, showing up, every person has to use their own judgment as to what's safe for them. And certainly at Temple Israel, we haven't sponsored any large group events. We've tried to provide ways for people to engage that enable those who are sitting simply at home to fully engage. There was another part to that question, but I'm not sure I answered it. Eric, you were going to say?
Well, it's so tricky. I think what she asked was actually not just about the protests themselves, but whether we celebrate the protests. And it's such a tricky time, obviously. And in my community, there's a major movement and a number of statements about race as well. But just about protests, I think it's difficult to stay safe in a large group. Obviously, it is possible, and I've got some great photos of people where they would trail the protest and stay distanced. I think that's somewhat important as a way to show support if you feel that you want to show support without endangering people. Another thing to understand, I think, for all of us is that some of this, and none of us here grew up as a person of color other than our religion effectively. So we can't understand the visceral nature that comes from someone who feels that someone who looks just like they do was killed perhaps for little to no reason. And so the visceral nature, I think, of something like that, I think we've all felt something visceral where we did something in reaction that didn't involve all of the elements of reason. Some people, probably fewer than in other contexts, are not thinking about, worried about, and maybe even some don't give full credence to the virus. And I've heard arguments on, you can imagine, opposite polar ends of the spectrum. How isn't it hypocritical to say that it's okay to protest when it's not okay to go to a political rally, and vice versa, right? So the thing that, I personally, if I be a little proselytizing, as I say, I think this virus is very real, and that no matter what the circumstance, that people should be careful, and that you can protest with some degree of care. Masks are one, but distancing is probably even a little bit better. And that would be, a full-on suggestion.
Everything that we are going to offer to our congregants to continue to engage in anti-racism is going to be virtual. We are not encouraging people to get out and be with other people. I want to be clear about that. I think there's also an interesting point about protest that you know from your work, and you mentioned the 60s, Eric. Many of us look back at that time, we think, oh, protest, that's how they got things done.
Right.
Those of us who've read and studied the movement know that the protests that we are aware of were part of enormous mass efforts, economic boycotts extending across an entire city over the course of months or years, strikes, again, across major industries, extending across weeks and months and years, mass meetings every night for weeks in churches, for weeks. We think we go to a protest for an hour and we've done something. We're a little bit misguided on that, don't you think?
I do, and one of the first people that pops into mind is Andy Young, because one of the great contributions that he made, one of the almost endless contributions that he made, is that he is such a great diplomat. And he took those words that Dr. King and others were saying about getting to know people, and he had just such a landmark moment in 1963 in Birmingham. Dr. King's in jail. Reverend Abernathy's in jail. There are many, many people who have been jailed for marching. And I believe, if my memory's right, Dr. King said, Andy, you can't march. I'm going to need you to take care of. So I think, and he may get angry at me a little, but I actually think sometimes he feels like he wanted to be out on the street a little bit more, but he was relegated to taking care of the business. And in any case, what he did, though, is he got to know, and they had these principles about you get to know people, as we talked about before, you negotiate with them, and if you can't negotiate and get anywhere, and it's a little more involved, but then you protest. And there's also an extremely important part here that gets overlooked a lot, which is after protests, especially after a victory, there is reconciliation. And Dr. King and all of his many foot soldiers and lieutenants would make it very clear from the first major protest he was involved with, again, Montgomery, 1955 to 56. At the end of the protest, when they won, not because they necessarily won ultimately through the protests, but when the Supreme Court said that this form of segregation is not constitutional, they had mass meetings about reconciliation. Do not rub it in the face of your neighbor, of your white neighbor, obviously in this case. Do not try to sit next to a white person if there are lots of other empties, on the bus when you go back and they're integrated. So the point that I think that Andy and Dr. King and all those others made was, it is important to protest at times. It's also important to lay the groundwork and then to properly resolve when it's over.
You mentioned Birmingham 1963 as a religious leader. I'm always aware that Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail was addressed specifically to 8 white men. 7 of them were the ministers of the largest Protestant churches in town.
Right.
And the 8th
Rabbi.
was the rabbi of the Reformed synagogue. And it was addressed to them because they were the ones saying, Dr. King, just wait, just hold off, just be patient. Not yet, not now. Those are the people to whom his letter was addressed.
It's a point he was, obviously he was extremely diplomatic in so many ways, but the point of gradualism is one that actually feeds back to the last question. There's no, when you're being denied rights, when you, and I think again, there were all kinds of murders and lynchings in the South. It's a little different what we're talking about today, although there are obvious roots, and a lot of it's happening up north much more commonly than in the South. There's plenty of racism everywhere. But here we have a situation where, for the most part, that particular protest in 1963 in Birmingham, and that was part of, everyone will remember the images that have burned into our minds of the fire hoses and the dogs. That was part of Birmingham. That protest was largely about the rights to what we would call public accommodations, to use the facilities like lunch counters and other things like that. Now there were tragedies. There were 4 little girls who were killed in Birmingham in a church explosion a few months afterwards. That was clearly set by the Klan. But I think what point you really brought home is that this gradualism is not something that can necessarily work in someone's viscera when they see their brother or their father or their cousin or their not so literal brother being killed for something that they just didn't see any reason for.
Right, absolutely.
This has been an unbelievable discussion. I just want to ask you for our time here. We're way past our 1 o'clock. Do we have time for some more questions? We'd like to keep going.
I'm good. If people want to keep going, I'm good.
You at home have the choice to stay.
I mean, it's not like I have a lunch appointment or anything. So.
So let's keep going.
Great.
Mike Holt says many see Jews as a privileged white population. How do we navigate the privileges many of us face with the persecution we face?
Yes, I think that's part of the unique contribution that we bring. It's why I don't personally identify as white, and I think it's helpful for us to just define ourselves as distinct from the general population of white Americans, is that we bring our own history of persecution. It wasn't so long ago. We've been very astute and fortunate to achieve what we've achieved. Part of it, we need to recognize, is because of our light skin, and that we've been afforded all of the opportunities and assumptions that white people get afforded in this society, in this country. So we've accomplished a lot in part because we're lumped in with the rest of white people, but if we think of ourselves as, we will consider ourselves white only if we forget that we're Jewish. And the forgetting that we're Jewish is forgetting that history.
Jacob Navone asks here, some of the leadership of the BLM movement have adopted the BDS narrative. How do we reconcile our desire to become anti-racist with respect to people of color, yet also, as your sermon implores, stand up for ourselves as Jews as well as demonstrate our support for Israel?
So thank you. Just to be clear, I think everybody knows what BLM means, but BDS is the movement to boycott, divest from, or sanction Israel. It's an attempt exclusively, I think, from the left to apply sanctions such as were applied to South Africa in the 70s and 80s to change Israeli policy in regard to the Palestinians. This is why I make the distinction. This is why I think we have a unique perspective and contribution to bring. As I said, say the words Black Lives Matter, absolutely. Espouse some of the ends of the goals of the movement, yes, certainly. But we have to be careful not to align ourselves institutionally or personally with institutions or organizations or groups that espouse BDS, which is anti-Zionist, anti-Zionism of other sorts, or which paint Israel as the enemy. It's entirely unfair and inappropriate and wrong to target Israel among all the nations of the earth as the racist actor. I will say, as your rabbi, Israel's a country like every other country. It does a lot of things really well. And are there some things that I wish it would do better? Sure. I would say the same thing about the United States of America. But to target Israel as the enemy, to the exclusion of pretty much every other nation on earth, is not only anti-Zionist, it is anti-Semitic.
Alan Gover, I'm sorry if I Gover.
You got it, Gover.
Do you see a way for us as a Jewish community to be friends with the Christian evangelical and charismatic Catholic communities with regard to their view on Israel, on one hand, and their conservative views with regard to their political orientation and cultural rights?
Yeah, it's actually easier.
Is it part of that listening?
Yes, for
and
sure.
dialogue that you were just talking about earlier?
Absolutely. It's actually easier in terms of listening and dialogue to have a relationship with groups that hold conservative social views. It's harder for us to have relationships with groups like that hold, I'll call it evangelical pro-Israel views. Why? And because I've done some research on this. Their evangelical pro-Israel views are often what we call supersessionary. So let me explain a little bit of what this means. So who are these groups that Alan is speaking about? Well, for example, when the administration inaugurated the new American embassy in Jerusalem, it was a good thing to move the embassy to Jerusalem. There was not a rabbi speaking at the opening ceremony. The two clergymen who spoke were Hagee and Jeffers, Robert Hagee and Jim Jeffers, I think is his name. Evangelical, pro-Israel preachers. They have galvanized a lot of Christian evangelical support for the state of Israel, which on the surface is a good thing. But the question is, why have they done it? Not just because they love Israel so much, but because their theology is such that they want to hasten the second coming of Jesus. And what will hasten the second coming in their theology is when all the Jews move to Israel. So up to here, we might not even have a problem. Well, Jewish theology says Jews, great, move to Israel. Christian, okay, great, move to Israel. Except what do they believe will happen when all the Jews move to Israel? Jesus will come back and make us all Christian. So I'm condensing their theology quite a bit, but essentially their ultimate goal is to make us not Jewish. If that's not anti-Semitic, what is? Mm-hmm. So we could say, well, that theology, not exactly what we believe, so we will take their support for the state of Israel and sort of ignore their theology. I have mixed feelings about that. I don't believe in their theology. I don't think it will happen, but I do think it's highly insulting. I think it's borderline anti-Semitic. So how do you balance an anti-Semitic theology with strong support for the state of Israel? That is a really an interesting contemporary Jewish conundrum.
I just have a closing to a story that was asked from one of our congregants, Jennifer Pressman. She'd like to know what was the end of the story for the firefighter. How was his response received? So we heard the story of how he spoke up, and others in the other coworkers, let's just call them, other firefighters, were also against this and vocalized. But how did that end up?
The lieutenant was suspended for a time, disciplined within the system of the Norwalk Fire Department, and reassigned to a different division or station, however they disciplined, so that he now works in a place separate from Horolick.
Bringing about self-reflection.
Yeah.
Speaking of Dr. King's comments about self-reflection and empathy, how do we go about self-reflection on this holiest of holidays to help us understand our own biases?
Yeah, I would love us to be able to do that. And that's why I offered some of those thoughts about the expectations and assumptions with which we were raised, especially about who's a Jew, who belongs in our synagogue. And we've done this before. It's not so long ago that, well, we've seen great strides in our community, in our country, for inclusion of gay, lesbian, bisexual individuals, transgender individuals. It's really amazing how far we've come in a short period of time. So I believe in us. I believe that we can do this. We've each gone through already in our lives through the process of thinking about the assumptions, the attitudes, the words and language with which we were raised regarding certain groups, and we've made those changes. So why not here? We can do this. I think it does involve thinking about the ways in which we were raised. And one of the most important things this year, especially for me, has been thinking about the concept of colorblind. Because we really all thought this was like such a noble way to view the world and not treat people differently based on the color of their skin. The problem with that is we've come to understand that people's lives are actually significantly different. And the way the world has treated them is significantly different based on the color of their skin. So to treat everybody the same just doesn't do justice, doesn't do honesty to their experience of the world.
Yeah, for my own thoughts, I was trying to think through how am I wired to think as far as this idea of everyone is colorless.
Right.
Am I, in my upbringing, am I wired to think that way or not? And it really helped me kind of take a moment and pause and really think through those, the acquired traits. I don't know what it is.
I call them paradigms in our mind.
Yeah, the paradigms
right?
of thought. Right.
We also, I was raised to think like, there's two paradigms. There's two, the paradigm of racist and not racist. And as long as I'm not like, wearing a hood, as long as I'm not, supporting David Duke or somebody like that, I'm all right. I'm on the right side. I recommend highly the work of Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who has really pioneered a shift in paradigm. It's really a mental shift in this paradigm, where he says, yes, there are racists out there, and then there's like the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the time, who are kind of just going about their lives, not actively oppressing people, but also not actively solving the problem either. So he's defined that there are racists, there's what the middle is, he calls the middle assimilationists or accommodationists, and then he defines anti-racists. and a third category. And he defines them not so much as people in their essence, oh, that person is an anti-racist, but a category that each of us can step into from time to time when we choose to oppose racist thought, racist action, racist structures in our society. And so what I'm urging us to do is to step into that category more often. The anti-racism training that I offered over the summer and the other anti-racism trainings that I'll be offering and participating in through the fall will help us explore some of these paradigms of the colorblind paradigm, the racist, anti-racist paradigm. That's really a core activity within these anti-racist trainings.
David Fleisch wants to know, how can we be vocally righteous without coming off as self-righteous? That doesn't mean them, not us.
Yeah, well, I think the question, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, first of all, it has to do with, first of all, who are we standing up for, right? If we're standing up for someone else, someone who's not Jewish, right, then we're not self-righteous. We're righteous for someone else. When we're standing up for ourselves, there is a way, to me, the definition of self-righteous is that we believe that we are right to the exclusion of everyone else. And that's not exactly what I'm advocating or asking. If we are to stand up to anti-Semitism, we could even do it with compassion and yet firmness, right? We might say, you know, I'm not sure if you realize that what you just said is actually a terrible anti-Semitic stereotype. Let me tell you about why it's so offensive to me. And so that's a way to stand up for ourselves that is not self-righteous. In the case of the firefighter, the story that I told, obviously, that's not the case. The person using it knew exactly what they were saying and why, and the firefighter stood up appropriately to it. But I think we may encounter interactions and experiences where the other person might not actually realize all the time what they're saying or what they're doing. Not just, by the way, not just anti-Semitic, but the other person, we might be part of conversations where the other person might not realize that what they're saying or doing is racist. And it's up to us to do something about that.
There's also a righteous versus self-righteous. I mean, you know, I think a lot is in the style, right? I mean, if you see someone do something that you're upset by and you feel like you want to address them, you know, if you come off as what we'd call pedantic or you know, chastising, that's going to sort of lead them to think you are being a little more self-righteous, or especially if anyone ever represents that they've kind of dealt with racism, I'm not a racist. You know, I think it's in how you present yourself to some degree, and I would doubt, I mean, I don't know all the particulars, obviously, and I would doubt, for example, that the firefighter who really took a stand did it in a self-righteous way. So I think it's almost like if we see a crime and we want to sort of try to help in some way, you know, there's not, I don't think we should fall into a trap of pointing something out we think is right and then worrying about being self-righteous.
Right.
So what do we do about, you know, Margie Friedman, who loves seeing her mom's sculpture in the background here? There's been a definite increase in anti-Semitism around the U.S., and it seems like your sermon, both holidays, has been really a call to action. You know, what do we do now to fight this going forward? What are you asking of us as a congregation? Like, what's the call to action?
Right. So I'm asking us not to sit on the sidelines and think it's going to be solved elsewhere, either anti-Semitism or racism, not to sit on the sidelines. I'm asking us to bring our full Jewish selves, our Jewish story, into these conversations, on the left, on the right, bring our history of oppression, bring our stories of success, bring our experience of being treated as white, even though we have a bit of a different perspective, bring our values and our principles, bring our heroes like RBG into the fight, and John Lewis as well, I'm asking us to stand up for ourselves because no one else is going to do it for us, and because we have the principle of mitzvah goreret mitzvah, which some people think of as a type of karma, but it's not. It's about habits. That's the word I was looking for. It's about building habits. You do one good thing, it gets you in the habit of doing the next good thing. It's about building habits, right? The first time you visit someone in the hospital, it's tough, it's scary, but the next time it's not as hard. The next time it's not as hard, et cetera, et cetera. If we start by standing up for ourselves, the next time maybe we'll be able to stand up for someone else, or maybe vice versa. We start by standing up for somebody we don't know. Maybe the next time we'll be able to stand up for ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the things that I'm asking us to do. I'm asking us to get involved on our local level. Margie, I know, doesn't live here in Connecticut. She lives in California. Margie, I'm sure there are plenty of things in your community. I'm not as familiar, but there's plenty of things in your community that you can do, even in a time of COVID, even without leaving your house, participating in government and in local institutions and in school and in police. There's plenty of ways that we can have a voice in repairing the injustice of the world.
You know, I apologize for everyone at home if we didn't get to all of your questions, but perhaps in closing, Art Cohen says, you know, so we heard you loud and clear. Looking ahead a year from now, okay, do you think our community will be in a better or worse place in terms of the issues that you raised, and how do we measure that?
Unsurprisingly, a great final question from Art. Yogi Berra once said, you should avoid making predictions, especially about the future. So I'm not going to make a prediction about whether we'll be in a better place or a worse place. But here's how we will know. Here's our metrics of how we know we'll be in a better, of how we will be able to define whether we're in a better place or a worse place. I don't know that the number of anti-Semitic incidents will go down. Ultimately, that would be the best. But I think our measure of success in the time frame of, let's say, a year, would be the number of times that we stand up to those anti-Semitic incidents. The number of times that we take action in our towns or larger society against those anti-Semitic incidents. God willing, there will be fewer. But we don't have so much control over that, do we? We're not the ones committing them. We're not the ones creating the atmosphere that makes them okay. If we create the atmosphere that makes them not okay, and if we respond with strength and conviction to them, that will be success. In terms of race, we have 400 years history. I'm not optimistic that everything's going to be solved in 1 year. But I think we already know, I think, some of the metrics, maybe not over the course of 1 year, but maybe over a course of a period of time. It's about police interactions with minorities, improving those interactions overall on a broad statistical basis. It's about enabling people of color to have greater opportunity in society. And that economic, educational, employment, I mean, healthcare, it goes in all sorts of ways. And addressing the inequities that we've come to see, which I just mentioned, healthcare, especially the pandemic has exposed huge inequities in healthcare. We can take steps to repairing many of those, even within a time frame as relatively brief as a year. We're not going to solve everything in a year, but if we can improve some of those metrics, some of which probably could be measured in the course of a year, some of which probably couldn't. You need a longer time frame for like healthcare outcomes. Those would be metrics of success. And I'll just finally add that, again, I started much more specifically speaking about our own Temple Israel community. If we can, I think we could do this. We could go through a year where there are no incidents of racism here within Temple Israel. That would be an amazing success. It's up to all of us to do that. That, I think, could be a goal, an attainable goal. Can we create what can we do here, in our community? We can continue to work with our police to help them improve their training and their protocols, as I mentioned. We can establish protocols for our schools, education within our schools for anti-racist protocols and anti-racist education. I know, for example, there's a bill before the legislature in Hartford. The Hartford legislature passed a Holocaust education bill just a couple of years ago. It's relatively weak in terms of its specifics. There are proposals to strengthen it. But now there's a bill before the legislature, I learned from one of our teen advocates, actually, that would mandate Black and Latino education in our schools. It's not just the passage of a bill, but the actual implementation of these measures that would be measures of success for us, for example. I want to take a moment to thank the two of you. Eric, Ari, thank you. This has been a great way to spend part of Yom Kippur afternoon, for me at least. And I want to thank everybody who's shared their questions, those we've gotten to and those we haven't had time for. I know our staff is going to forward me all the questions just as they did for Rosh Hashanah, so I'll take time after the holiday to respond to each person individually. Thank you so much.
Nice to be with you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Gemar Chatima Tova, and a continued easy and meaningful fast.